Are Christian apologists lying to their audiences? Are they ignoring or misrepresenting the scholarship? And if so, why are they afraid of the truth? These are accusations that are making their way around the social media world in the counter-apologist skeptical community. And that's what we're going to address today on the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. To help us do this, we are joined by author, cultural commentator, and I would say astute observer of all things related to religion in the public square, our good friend Bethel McGrew. Bethel, good afternoon for you. How are you doing this morning? I know you're having some technical issues, but I think we got you loud and clear here.
Yes, many technical issues today. Good afternoon to you, Tony. I'm doing well. Actually getting ready to celebrate my birthday soon this week, which is going to be fun. And then I'm flying to London next Tuesday. So, trying to get all the work. Yeah, trying to get the work done that I should have been doing.
Is that a birthday trip to London?
No, it's unrelated.
Okay.
But yes. Well, how's birthday celebration?
At what point does the young fogey not be young anymore? That's my first question.
She's forever young. That's the answer.
I'm going to be 32. Is that young?
Yeah, that's pretty young compared to, with the exception of Logan. That's pretty young compared to the other two on this podcast. And the other two on this podcast are Lenny Esposito, the vice president of the Kirkwood Center, and Logan Zeppieri, the treasurer/secretary of the Kirkwood Center, although we don't know how much treasuring or secretarying he actually does. My name's Anthony Costello, the putative president of the Kirkwood Center. So, all right, Bethel, this is a claim that really is going around the internet. I've seen it made by several skeptical atheist counter apologists, whatever we want to call them, especially since Wes Huff's recent popularity, meteoric rise to fame, which I would say that Wes didn't necessarily seek that out, right? It did fall in his lap, although he's a very good guy, very good apologist, good scholar too, and still in his dissertation phase up at the University of Toronto. But after Wes's appearance, and we've had Wes on the show, we had him on before the Billy Carson debate, the Joe Rogan podcast, the PBD podcast, and I think he's going to be on Russell Brand next. But before all that, there was some accusations like this going around, but now I'm seeing it more and more often. And this is the claim that, these Christian apologists, which is a key term for these folks, they're lying. It's not just that their conclusions are wrong or they've made errors in their thinking. It's that they're outright lying to their audiences, which of course obviously would entail that something like they know the truth, either in a philosophical defense of something like the existence of God, or they know the truth about where the real scholarship is with regards to the New Testament or the Old Testament, but they're just lying. They're covering that truth up and they're telling you something different. So I wanted to get your take on this because I'm seeing it kind of as almost like a meme-like thing now that's going around.
Yeah, and I mean, like you say, this isn't something new. It's been the kind of YouTube atheist apologist shtick for quite a while. But Wesley has given Christian apologetics the highest profile hearing of anything so far. So I think there's probably more than a little jealousy in the mix because, I mean, that's got to hurt. An evangelical Christian apologist gets to go on the biggest podcast in the world and everyone loves it. I mean, man, that's just so. And I was very unimpressed, and I was watching Alex O'Connor's response and taking notes and just like waiting for him to make a substantive point, and that moment never came. And he just would spend so much time picking over the smallest stuff and then totally gloss over major arguments that Wes was bringing out. It's like, have anything to say about that? No? Okay, I guess we'll spend 5 more minutes talking about the 500 or whatever, or the Isaiah scroll or what have you.
Yeah, right.
So, lots of disingenuous stuff. I think the atheists were being disingenuous for sure. And based on a general prejudice, which I think Rogan understood, by the way. And I thought it was interesting that it was sort of that meta conversation was brought out between Joe and Wes, that there's a general bias against people who happen to think that this stuff is true and want to make arguments defending it. It's like, oh, they can't possibly be serious. They can't be serious scholars. They can't be in touch with serious scholarship because look at all these smart people who disagree. They've got, there's got to be an agenda. They've got to be covering stuff, distorting stuff. But luckily, never fear, the atheist counter apologists are here.
Right. No, that was a point that Rogan brought up.
That's what I
remember highlighting it as I posted it on Facebook. I'm like, and I said, like, Rogan hits the nail on the head here. It was like an hour or so into it where he makes this, he's aware of this, the sociological problem of, well, the universities are dominated by liberals, leftists, skeptics, atheists, and to step out of bounds is to be sort of shunned by the academic community. You're really an iconoclast. That's right now if you take an Orthodox Christian view on something and any of the issues, right?
Yeah, I think some of this also comes down to atheists not truly understanding scholarship, and I'm going to offer two examples. The first one is if you're ever talking at all about any kind of creationism, any science faith issue, they always say, well, what's the peer review? What's the peer, has it been published in a peer review journal? How come none of the creation accounts are published in peer review journals? As if peer review in and of itself is the sanctification process that makes something true. And as we've come to discover, especially when you look at social science publications, but more and more even with the hard sciences, peer review many times is non-replicatable. So in other words, even though it was in a peer-reviewed journal, it's still junk science. And just because something's peer-reviewed, just because you've sent something to all your colleagues who have the same bias as you, and they all say, that's great. We've seen it in gender studies and all these other aspects as well. That peer review in and of itself does not make that good scholarship. And that's one of the things I think the internet atheists miss. They assume what they're talking about is academic, and it's not. The second thing I think is interesting is, and I saw this with even Bart Ehrman, when Ehrman, this has got to be 5 or 6 years ago at least, went on one of the popular atheist podcasts after his book, Forged came out. And he made the claim in that book that the writers of the Gospels are not the names that are attached to them. And when you say that those are the names of the people, then what you're doing is you're creating a forgery. Because if it's not true and you're saying it's true, then it's something else, something that we call forgery. And that was his book. Anyway, when he goes on the podcast, one of the atheist interviewer said, gee, I wonder what Bible would actually read like if we could find the actual autographs. If we found the actual, what do you think, Bart, it would actually read? And Ehrman, who is actually a scholar, had to say, well, it would read pretty much as we have it. No. I mean, if we found the real ones, the first ones that were actually written. And Ehrman said, yeah, it would read as what we have, And so they have this assumption that they're biases being pulled into this discussion are scientific or accurate or scholastic when they don't understand the scholarship at all. They don't understand how scholarship works. And I think that's a big, big issue.
Yeah. And a lot of my mom's scholarly work in biblical studies is just, it's just like getting in there and like cutting out a lot of the cancer in biblical scholarship and exposing all of these terrible habits, terrible arguments, patterns of argument that get enforced and reinforced in the process of peer review, like you're saying, Lenny. And it's just unquestioned because, like, well, this is how we've always done it. This is how everyone does this scholarship. And mom's like, yes, I know. I'm saying it's bad. And here's my carefully reasoned argument for that,
Well, and it usually takes somebody who's like a scholar of like intellectual history to see these things, that models are built in any discipline, usually by somebody who just becomes very like so much of Ehrman's work still it works off of the Bultmann model, right?
It does.
And Bultmann was just, a lot of them actually. A lot of the guys who built these models that we still sort of suffer under, perhaps, were the German higher biblical critics of the late 19th and mid 20th century.
Yeah. The other
And
thing
then to be a scholar, you sort of have to work in that framework. And if you don't, you're outside of the guild, right?
Yep. That's
and
true.
I think like a lot of the online atheists who don't read the scholarship themselves, what they'll do is they'll go out and they'll grab some young, they'll grab Ehrman or like some kind of Ehrman part 2, version 2.0, who sort of is in works in that framework, because, to get research grants or whatever, or I mean, not that the humanities get many grants, but in order to be sort of in that guild, you have to work within that model. And if you don't, you're not going to get published or whatever. I don't think they understand that. So you grab somebody who's working. I mean, Ehrman's firmly in that German higher biblical. I mean, the only book I read by him was an academic book where he was defending the Walter Bauer multiple Christianities thesis. It was a good book, but he's working in that strain. And I don't think a lot of these online atheists or skeptical apologists realize that when you grab that guy, you're grabbing a guy who's working in his own sort of preset, with his own set of preconditions.
Yeah, well, right. And you're also grabbing a guy who lies, frankly. I mean, we want to talk about lying. Ehrman bends the truth and artfully leaves stuff out to create a narrative where, I mean, you don't even need a degree in Bib studies or whatever. You can just open up your Bible and go and look at how he's cherry picking and crafting his thesis. And I think he actually, to a degree, knows better. But he knows that he can get away with some of those tactics in books that are written to a popular audience. So he just does it anyway. And so I think it's a blend.
He doesn't do it in academic settings. And that's the tell. William and Craig noted that when he's in academic settings, he realizes that he can't get away with that stuff. So he definitely dials all of that back. What did Bill call him? He has the scholar Ehrman and then the popular, the bad Bart, or something like that.
But so there's that. But I do think obviously there's plenty of stuff Ehrman does earnestly believe and trot out in that school, as you're saying. And there's a lot of respects in which a robustly Christian view, even aside from the fact that we literally believe Jesus rose again, there's a supernatural bias, but even a level below that, we're going to say things that go against consensus scholarship, like the claim that the Gospels go back to the reports of eyewitnesses, the fact that they're holistically reliable and trustworthy. You don't have consensus on that, as Alex O'Connor was reminding everybody in his reply to Wes. It was like he was so outraged. Wes is confidently going against the consensus. Well, scholars don't agree. It's like, yes, Alex, we get it. We just don't care.
Well, and I even would raise a challenge there. Like, does Alex O'Connor know what the consensus? I wonder if the consensus is something that can even really be known. I mean, you would need to do a very sort of meta level analysis, right? I think, like, I don't know, maybe some people have tried to do that. And I'm not saying that when you're going to conferences constantly in New Testament or studies or whatever, and every year, you're going to have a greater awareness of what the general views are out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think to a degree we can. I mean, my mom has definitely put in the legwork to, go into the primary sources and read a lot of the literature and kind of get a sense of the lay of the land, so to speak. And, as we move into potential legitimate criticisms of the apologetics community, I do think there's a major problem with popular Christian apologists either not really understanding the literature or not engaging with it, not being aware of it, not being aware of how best to handle it or respond to it. But
that might be the case. I mean, certainly on the New Testament issues, right? Like issues surrounding New Testament or textual criticism. I mean, for example, I'll take Wes's. I mean, one of the big things was, he made this statement about the great Isaiah scroll. I'm not a textual 1Q.
Yeah, that's the one.
Isaiah or whatever. And I did a little bit of studying on Old Testament textual criticism for one semester several years ago. But I remember, like, I know the guys you would have to go to make any kind of authoritative statements on Old Testament textual criticism. You have to talk about guys like Emmanuel Tove, right? For example. And Wes does know this stuff, and he came out with a video that qualified his statements on Rogan regarding the scroll and the word for wordness of it. And that's fine. I mean, there is always a sense when you're on a podcast like Joe Rogan, 3.5 hours, you're, talking about all kinds of topics. There is always a challenge out there. And I don't think a lot of the atheist community, I mean, they have to do the same thing, but they're not giving a lot of wiggle room here. There is a sense where you have to generalize the scholarship that you're aware of. You have to sort of distill things down to make a point. And there can always be some accuracy lost in that process, but that's going to cut both ways. Right. So, yeah, I think we always understand there's always a scholarly debate going on any given topic. But when you're trying to just get some basic points across, you can't go into the whole thing. Right. You do have to distill it down and make it accessible to a popular community.
Oh, yeah, totally. And I think, I think Wes handled that well. And of course, as we've been discussing, there's this well poisoning, this assumption that anytime that you make a mistake, it must be because you're trying to hide something. And I don't think that's the case for Wes at all. So I agree with you. Yeah, you have to distill. However, you do need to understand it. And so that's a problem I see is people just outright misrepresenting. And sometimes people will misrepresent Ehrman even. And obviously I'm no lover of Ehrman, but I do think it's important to represent fairly what he says and not try to extract more from it than is actually there. If we're trying to, quote mind skeptics and see whether we can use things that skeptical people say for the purposes of our own argument. Lenny, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, just one other point before we move on the whole idea of consensus and where scholarship is going. There's a couple of things that I note. First of all, I think the most applicable approach to this really is a book by a philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, because I think his analysis of what paradigm shifts are and how they happen, that you do have a consensus. So, for example, everybody thought that the aether was this thing that permeated the universe, and that was the scientific consensus. We know it's completely wrong. That's not true. But it takes that old guard who were all taught this, who had all vested 20 to 30 years of their academic work and their life into this process. They actually have to die off, or they have to have the errata build up so heavily that the theory becomes hopelessly mired, and they have to then reformulate. And we've seen this over and over in the hard sciences. It just so happens that accelerates quickly in the textual criticisms, the soft sciences. It doesn't necessarily happen as quick. Documentary hypothesis, I think that's more or less kind of died a death ever since they started doing things like running one of Shakespeare's plays through it, and it came out that there were 4 different authors for it and stuff like this.
Right.
So
and we just did a podcast on that with Michael Thigpen too.
Yeah,
coming out. So
exactly. So, but I think that's part of it as well. Consensus doesn't carry as much weight as it should, unless we have no other answers. We can start there, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't question it, and that doesn't mean questioning it is somehow egregious or wrong.
Yeah, follow up on that, because I like that you brought up the Kuhn book. It's something that I had to study extensively when I was over in England. And this is also a question I would like you guys to kind of jump in on and see if I'm tracking with this correctly or not. But you do have a paradigm shift in maybe in the content of the belief, or maybe the justifications for like what you believe in a particular theory. But I also think there's these shifts in the mode in which these theories are being presented. And I think we're kind of on like the tail end, or maybe at the start of a new way in which this information is being presented. You can go back to maybe like the work of like Plantinga or Imwagon or Craig, and separate from maybe what they believed or what their particular theories were, they were highly analytic. They kind of came onto the scene dominating the debate world. It was sort of, and it was elevated at one point, like, oh, if Christians really are true, then they will come to the debate stage. And then they came to the debate stage, and then it sort of turned where it was like, well, the debate stage sort of unfairly caters to these highly analytic lawyer type presenters of misinformation. And so now we're going to shun them. And that was like a bad PR move. It was like, oh, well, now you're just escapist. And it seems like what has shifted now is like, well, now it's about the story. You have like the Joe Rogan Experience. You have like Jordan Peterson with this sort of psychological narrating of the Bible that is sort of like fundamentally true to how the psychological makeup of the human person may be, independent of the actual facts. And then you have sort of like the Alex O'Connor thing where it's almost like, oh, well, we go on this journey with us to like how you can come to know like what the real truth is. And I feel like the Christians, maybe the popular Christian apologists, are trying to be like, how do you do analytic stuff, but then present it in a very story-like weaving fashion? Maybe it's disingenuous on the Christian side, but there seems to be a shift in the mode of presenting old information that the Christians have sort of built up over the last 20 or 30 years.
That's possible.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lenny.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to say was, and this is, I noticed this whenever I watch like documentaries on the History Channel, the Bible Secrets television shows and things like that. My wife, by the way, doesn't let me watch those anymore. I tend to yell at the television too much. But what they usually do, it's a fascinating script. They will interview somebody who has an idea. Okay, well, the Israelites really didn't migrate en masse out of Egypt in the Exodus. They were actually a nomadic tribe. They spurred in the southern Levant maybe 5,000 to 10,000 people, and they grew, blah, blah, blah. And then but the scholar is usually still speaking in qualified statements. It's possible that this is the case kind of thing. But then the narrator says, well, if that's true, then how would they do this? How would they begin to take over all of it? And then they bring in another guy with another theory that then answers that second question. But the two scholars didn't necessarily have their theories lined up contiguously. So what they do is they assume the first possibility, and then they run with it to put into the second possibility, and then they run with it to put into the third possibility, ignoring the problems that theory one causes for theory two. And we saw this with Alex O'Connor when he started to say something to the effect of, and this is where he lost all credibility with me, when he said, well, we have more evidence for the Mormon eyewitnesses than we do for the eyewitness resurrection.
Oh my gosh, that was ridiculous.
And I'm going, wait a minute, the Mormon eyewitnesses, nobody said, hey, you can come and question them if you want. They're still here standing in front of you. Hey, the Mormon eyewitnesses, the Sanhedrin is going to kill them. It was so apples to oranges. And the fact that O'Connor would say that I have better evidentiary data for Mormonism than I do historic Christianity. That's a primary example. Now, do we say Alex O'Connor was lying, or is he just so mired in his biases that he just completely missed the boat? I don't know, but that's the kind of thing I'm seeing.
Bethel?
Yeah, and also, there's also, just to touch on Mormonism, there's the quality of the testimony. I mean, if you actually look at what they say, well, we saw the plates with the eyes of the Spirit, whatever that's supposed to mean.
Right.
It's just, there's just so much ridiculousness. Also, I noticed that this silly Jubilee thing where Alex was going up against 25 Christians in a circle or whatever, it actually was more like 21 Christians and 4 Mormons from what I heard later. And of course, he picks the Mormon guy. Now, in fairness, I don't know that Alex knew the guy was Mormon ahead of time. Maybe he was just dressed a little more nice or whatever. But the way the show works is that at the end you get to pick somebody out of the crowd to chat with for a full 10 minutes without being interrupted. So then the Mormon guy is all smug, and he comes on. He's talking about how all the Christians are wrong, and my theology is so much better and takes care of all the problems Alex is raising. So, which I'm sure Alex just loved because, that's a big part of his shtick now is just trying to compare Christianity with everything else and show how Christianity always comes out looking worse.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of wrap this section up. So I mean, we start off because again, there's a claim. I mean, I think Apologia, who referenced our video with Wes, makes this claim about apologists lying or at least obscuring what they know to be true. And of course, for him, he often does then bring like just Bart Ehrman or somebody who's studied under Bart Ehrman on as their New Testament scholar. And then you're supposed to sort of believe that that person working in the Armenian tradition, I hate to say that, it's a Boltmanian tradition, primarily, I would say. They represent the scholars. So my guy represents the consensus, your guys don't. I mean, just a side note. And one thing is I read a lot of commentaries. I'm not a New Testament scholar, but I read a lot of commentaries, right? I read Old Testament, New Testament commentaries. And I tell you, what I don't like in a lot of these is when there is just and this can go both ways for the Christian apologist or for the skeptic, when you just say scholars believe or the consensus is. I'd like to hear names, like Culpepper says in his commentary, or Carson says, or Edwards, and it's like I always at least try to do that. I did that on our podcast with Wes because I just read James Edwards' commentary on Luke. I find that is something that we could also do. We could be better at actually referencing, because I think when I think New Testament scholarship, I primarily am thinking commentaries, right? And going to commentaries and see what the different commentators say in their works and how they're arguing. And I mean, I just see that rarely done on either side, to be fair. But then again, there's this problem that, you do have to generalize scholarly content for a popular audience, right? I think that's people need to take note of that and take that as just a general problem for everybody. The third thing that I think I see when the skeptics make this claim of lying, they also add a psychological assertion, something like that would allude to the idea that Christian apologists are like psychologically fragile or emotionally fragile. So they have to lie to sort of, it's an old social psychological kind of take that you have to do this in order to maintain, what Peter Berger would have called plausibility structures, right? So you just keep sort of telling yourself this. And of course, that's just sort of asserted as being the case, that apologists are psychologically or emotionally fragile creatures, and therefore they have to lie. And maybe in a sense, they're not just lying to you, they're lying to themselves.
That's right. And, that's a deep assumption. And it's not just the, silly YouTube counter apologists where you're going to find that. I mean, I found that in a conversation I had with Tom Holland. It wasn't public, but, I was kind of gently challenging some stuff that he'd said in a podcast about the Gospels. And he didn't really react that well to it. And he basically tried to do a bit of bulverism on me and say, I know you really want this to be true. So you're really kind of you're grasping for straws, and I get it. It's because this is so important to you. And I'm thinking, okay. Or people will say, take the technique of harmonizing. The skeptic brings out a supposed contradiction. You go, well, okay, here's an idea for how both of those things could just be different angles. And, oh, okay, you're just a fundamentalist then. I see what you're doing. This is just this desperate Christian apologist tactic to try to avoid the obvious. We see what's happening there. And then you go, well, no, actually harmonizing is something historians do all the time. It's a normal tactic of analyzing documents. It's not like some Christian fundamentalist thing.
Ever since the Diatessaron.
Yeah, right. But people will straw man that, and they'll say, oh, I suppose you think the cock crowed 9 times or whatever, But that's something that you see happening a lot, is that people will slap a label of desperate fundamentalist apologist tactic on something that's just a normal tool.
Right. Yeah, I think that's important to point out too, because that's just sort of a sneaky little tactic. It's got some rhetorical force because it places doubt in the the whoever's watching. Oh, these people aren't rational. They're not rational actors or something.
Look,
And,
I mean, and if we're talking about emotion, we weren't the ones who labeled ourselves sprites. Okay, so if you're talking about emotional,
you're talking about Daniel Dennett.
Yeah, the Brights movement. Yeah. So yeah, it's that sword can cut both ways. I'd be careful with it.
I just remember what J.P. Moreland said about Daniel Dennett in a philosophy of mind class, where he said, "And now let's turn to Daniel Dennett, a philosopher who no stupid idea has ever crossed his desk that he hasn't entertained," or something like that. So okay. Yeah, so I wanted to make one more point about that psychologizing tactic. Well, I will say, okay, this was it. I do think that this tactic of trying to ascribe psychological fragility to the Christian apologists, and maybe I want to talk a little bit about the term apologetics as well. We can do that in the next part. I do think that this ascription is usually made, you'd have to go look, by YouTubers who themselves were once Christian, and then I wonder if there's not sort of another sort of maybe we should do a reverse psychological analysis on sort of home of origin issues or something. But it seems to be the most aggressive of those making that claim themselves have had a lot of interaction with Christianity as they were growing up. But I don't know. All right. Logan, you were going to go.
Oh, I was just agreeing with you that it's a weird form of storytelling that I can't tell if it's intentional to mask things or if it's a way in which just the popularizers of information are like enjoying the story. So now internet atheists and Christians are trying to do storytelling, and some of them are doing them very poorly, or if maybe they're doing intentionally to mask things. But it's just because they're like fundamentally contradictory. Like when you just made the claim that like, oh, I used to be a Christian. They'll start with that. So the assumption is like, well, I believed all that, and I've kind of come on the other side. It's like true, but then they'll turn around and be like, well, Christians are the ones that are making all these claims, and they have to defend them all. And it's like, so can a Christian come and say, well, as a former atheist myself, I then became a Christian, so now I really got beyond the atheist. It's just like this bizarre, like hero's journey.
Yeah, well, that doesn't count. Because then it's like, oh, I see the Christians got to you, and now you're working this grift, the ex-atheist grift. We see what you're doing, and it's like, okay, so there really are no common standards.
Nobody's
here.
ever been atheist, Bethel. Yeah. No one has ever been
That's
atheist.
Right.
It's like truly atheist, not no true atheist. No true Scotsman. All right, well,
in the bosom, then it's like that's what it is. That's where it's so bizarre. It's like it's just this weird form of storytelling that has emerged, and I don't know if it's because of the post like analytic like investment that like these Christian philosophers
shift
done. So I think they did very well, independent of like maybe the particular beliefs, and we could have that debate. But the form, I think, just the Christian analytic philosophers like dominated for so long. Maybe it's just like this is the new thing, and Christians aren't in there, and so we're gonna like do storytelling now.
Well, and maybe the medium of the social media medium is also facilitating that, because people know that
I think that's huge.
You relate to storytelling more than to rigorous analytic,
I was going to make
or mathematical argumentation.
Yeah, and this I think will help segue into the next segment actually, but to expand on the point about new media, a new age, moving beyond the debate era. I think it's a very good thing that we're leaving the debate era behind, because I never thought that debates were actually the best venue in which to have these kinds of conversations. Just because I think a lot of the best evidence for Christianity is actually a little bit subtle, and it's a cumulative case. There's lots of moving parts, and a guy like Bart Ehrman, who's a very slick salesman, he's a very fast talker, he's very rhetorically good, he's able to kind of get in there and reel off a whole bunch of half-truths really quickly, that it would take some time to kind of sit down and pick through all of this and like, okay, that's just outright false. that's kind of true, but it's misleading. That okay, there's several reasonable explanations, da da da, and down you go. But you don't have time for that under the constraints of a debate with opening statements and rebuttals and stuff. So I think some of the problems that I've seen in how Christian apologetics is done was, to a degree, an attempt to sort of play to the debate stage by trying to oversimplify stuff um, and be like over optimistic in the claims that they tried to make. Whereas now what we saw with Wes Hoffa and Rogan, they had 3 hours to just play. Yeah. And, hey, Jamie, pull up that video on automastic congruence or whatever. It's just like, and Wesley was just going to town and bringing out all the juicy detail stuff, and Joe was just eating it up. I'm like, that is the proper space. That finally, we're in a new media era where we have the time to really roll this out the way that it should be rolled out, I think. And so I would like to see Christians shift the way they argue and shift some of their tactics accordingly.
No, it's a good point. I mean, it's a good point. Yeah. Go ahead, Logan.
I just wanted a quick follow-up. Like, so are you saying like the best medium would be like a Joe Rogan experience of 3 hours, just sort of having a conversation about?
Yeah. Yeah, I think a long leisurely conversation is a way better way to kind of unfurl this than the kinds of very stiff debates that you saw back in the noughties.
So I
Looks
think
like we have to clear up our schedule a little bit then and extend this out.
I'm doing it already.
So one of the things that I think, though, debates do serve a purpose. When I spoke with Bill Craig, one of the reasons why he began really dedicating himself to debates was because he said, this way, when I speak to an audience, I can at least be sure that probably half of them are non-believers, that on a university campus, you're going to get at least 50% of that audience who've never even heard a Christian make a cogent, intelligent argument before. And bring out some of the details. And so it for him became a jumping off point, a springboard, so that you can have those longer discussions one-on-one. I find that also to be true online. And anyone who has a YouTube channel will tell you, it's not the 1 hour podcasts that garner the most eyes. It's the shorts. The shorts are what everybody, and they are also, in my experience, what the internet atheists grab on to watch and comment on. And then they're the ones that are saying, of my shorts, they're saying, you're lying. How can you lie like this? And I said, did you watch the entire video? And then you get crickets. And so you do have some of that as well, because the medium itself, by its audience, it gets dictated as to what the message is. So there is a little bit of kind of movie trailer vibe going on, where you can't judge the worthiness of the argument only by the short, but that seems to be where a lot of the discussion is coming from.
Well, and I think you're not wrong, but then I would also say, and I think this is true in all kinds of contexts, not just apologetics or whatever, I think Christians should sort of push back on the spirit of the content age, just like constantly worrying, okay, is this going to get clicks? Is my thumbnail cute enough? And there are certain channels that I won't name that seem very concerned with that sort of thing and less concerned with the actual substance of the content they're putting out. And so I think that's a real trap. It's something to be mindful of and try to avoid.
Well, and there is, and I won't name names either, but I mean, I guess a lot of people who are considered YouTube apologists themselves are not not even just scholarship, but they're not even really doing their own writing.
Yeah.
Right. They're just moderating conversations, and that's fine. I mean, there's a place for just having somebody who's a good moderator of a conversation or a good interview.
That's what Joe Rogan does. But
that's what right, exactly. And probably one of the reasons why our podcast isn't as big is because I'm doing the interviews and the moderating. So, but there could be a conflation there, like so-and-so is a YouTube apologist, when in fact, okay, they're not an apologist in the sense of somebody who's doing this subset of theology that used to be called polemics or lengthic theology. they're just a moderator. They're just a talk show host. Okay. So like, maybe you need to be careful there. It's Lenny, to your point about like, I wonder, this is interesting now that you brought up like, Bill Craig or Bill, can I call him Bill? William Lane Craig, WLC, in his heyday in the 90s and early 2000s, doing the live debates against scientists, philosophers from other universities, et cetera, where it was like, oh my gosh, there were people sitting in a church or even in a hall or at a university saying, I never even heard defenses of Christianity, let alone defenses at this level. But maybe now there's been enough of that, given the analytic, the renaissance, as he used to say, of philosophy or religion, and the popularization of theology by the guys like Jordan Peterson, where now it's not so much that the Christian audiences is like, I've never heard anybody even give an argument for Christianity. Maybe we're sort of beyond that point. And now we are at a point where we can be more in the like, let's have the longer sort of dialogue, like that Bethel was talking about.
You wouldn't, even in Christian radio, you wouldn't necessarily hear those kinds of things. You'd hear your pastor's Sunday sermon, but so the fact that social media exists today changes the landscape dramatically, because now you can go and look for answers from at least some type of reputable source and watch an entire hour lecture series given to astute academics or whomever. And so the fact that YouTube exists today does change it. However, some people won't seek that out. So one of the things that I used to do, we had a church that they would have a college campus ministry, and we would set up a couple of tables, and we'd put 2 or 3 of us behind a table with a couple of microphones. We'd put one microphone out in the foyer, and then we'd have a bunch of students on both sides holding up signs like, does God exist? Why is there evil in the world? These kinds of things, so that at lunch, and we'd always tell the Atheist Club, by the way, we're going to be here, bring your tough questions. And then the atheists would be the ones that would approach the microphone at first, and they'd hear the exchange and the back and forth, but they would have the students of the club in the crowd with the people starting to gather around, and they're saying, what do you think of that? And sparking conversations. But again, it was taking the message to the people that way, who may never otherwise hear it or even search for it. So there is a place for that. There is a place where people are, algorithms are a thing, and you're only going to get fed what you reinforce. And so usually that's the worst aspects of whatever the argument is you're looking at. But there is a way to reach out using some of these dynamics. It's just a whole lot different than it was in the 90s when you had to go to a debate to hear a debate, especially a Christian debate.
Yeah. Well, and this is because I want to press this a little bit further, and even throw the question back at Bethel, because like as you said, like there are places for debate. I mean, inherently, this is how we determine who's innocent, who's guilty in law, and this is how we debate law. Like there are like fundamental ways in which debate is maybe the only way in which we come to conclusions that are like massively important. With Craig and them, as Tony had said, he was debating a lot of scientists. Sometimes you get a lawyer in there or something like that, but a lot of them were scientists, physicists, those sorts of things, in which logic and mathematical structure, even the way in which they thought and spoke, sort of like debate was the platform to do it. And this is why I wanted to ask, kind of rotate back to Bethel and be like, is there mediums that are just better than other mediums? Are there ones that are inherently like Christians should not be participating in these mediums? Or is it more of this like, maybe this like, C.S. Lewisian kind of view of like, well, the audience you're trying to reach has a prerogative almost in a way of determining the platform. Like scientists, it's debate. So if we want to reach them, we're going to have to be debating. If we want to reach maybe the Alex O'Connor kind of people, we're going to have to start telling stories.
Well, I don't know if anything can reach Alex O'Connor at this point, to be honest.
No, he's making a living off of being skeptical.
I'm losing hope at this point. But no, you're right, Logan. There is a place for debate. And I did really enjoy it when Peter Williams debated Bart Ehrman a few years ago on the Unbelievable Conversations, Big Conversations show. What was interesting is I noticed people criticizing Peter after that, because Peter's British. He has kind of a different style from your sort of hard charging American apologist types. And so I saw some people saying, "Oh, he was kind of lame. He didn't do very well." I'm like, I think he did great. Did better than a lot of other people who've tried to debate Ehrman. I think what I would say though is think very carefully about whether you are suited for a debate, because I think a lot of Christians, in a well-intentioned way, are kind of galloping out there like, I'm going to defend the truth of Christianity. Fight me, atheists. Fight me, Reddit atheists. I'm just going to, yeah, I'll go on the YouTube channel. Yeah, I'm going to debate you guys. And consider whether you're actually prepared to do that, whether you've really done the reading, whether your rhetorical skills are up to snuff. I mean, a guy like Alex O'Connor, again, like Ehrman, he's very slick. He's very quick. He's got a British accent. If you don't have a British accent, what else do you have to compensate? And I mean, I realize those questions aren't substantive, but when it comes to debate, unfortunately, that's the kind of stuff you have to take into consideration. So I think there is a place for debate. But I think Christians should be more reluctant, let's say, to wade into it than some other contexts where there's less pressure.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, that's a skill that needs to be cultivated,
Exactly.
And usually even better from a young age. I mean, that's why Craig was so good at it, because he was doing it from the time he was like in grade school or high school, right? So you get into a habit. You have a habituated, to use thinking of Aristotle here.
I will say though, but to Logan's point though, I do think that Craig, he is on the cerebral side, and I think there are certain areas where that doesn't help him. And a conversation or two that he's actually had with Alex where it just, I feel like Alex actually sort of won, and Craig's sort of limitations became more apparent. And so I think we need communicators who can bring all the different things together. This is why C.S. Lewis is my lodestar, because Lewis he had such range. I think the word range is really key here. But that's a little difficult to find. It's hard to find somebody who's well-read, got some chops, has some scholarly background, but also is just good at telling a good story, and tugging on people's heartstrings as well as tickling their brain. I mean, yeah, that's not, those people aren't exactly thick on the ground.
That's right. No, that's true. That's true. I mean, Lewis synthesized, took the best of Chesterton and MacDonald, right? And sort of.
Except better, I think.
Yeah. Oh, better than Chesterton?
Yeah, he's a better.
Oh, careful. Oh, Bethel. Logan's on. Logan's on with it. Uh-oh.
We'll take this outside. We'll discuss.
In fact, Logan, where is our Chesterton quote of the day? Because we haven't.
And that's why I agree with Bethel is. Oh, man.
The thing about Chesterton quotes is that they're rarely the exact identical words that Chesterton said, because what Chesterton actually said is kind of involved and convoluted.
Yeah,
it's really, what somebody.
You have to think about it for a
year. Yeah.
I was somebody was, so we're talking about going back and forth with somebody about orthodoxy, and I'm like, what's the use of, when I was reading orthodoxy, I'm like, what's the use of underlining sentences in a book when if you've underlined every sentence in the book?
Sandway.
All right, well, let's shift the lens. Okay, so we talked a lot about the skeptics and some of the tactics they're doing. Yeah, go ahead if you want to touch base on that previous point, Logan.
No, because I used to jump on Discords and stuff and listen to these arguments, and it was always fun to you have these kids that jump on and just get smashed. Like, I'm going to defend Christianity, and just get smashed by bad arguments. But it seems like a point that's being made, and I in churches and stuff, and it's always controversial. I don't think it's controversial, but I want to make sure this is where we're at. It's like a virtue. It's bad to not be skilled in apologetics. This is what we're willing to say. If you don't have the skills, then don't do it. Are we going that far, or what is the having the range, being adept to the medium? Or are we saying that these are legitimate questions you should be? If you're a bad writer, don't write books. Is that what we're trying to say?
I think that's a fair question, and let's look at other aspects of life. Okay, let's look at, say, even the COVID-19 debacle that happened a few years ago. Most people didn't have a medical degree. Most people aren't reading the medical literature. But you can say, I have reservations. This doesn't jibe with certain aspects of common sense. I've read some stuff. I haven't read all stuff. So for me, I have red flags here. I think before you come down positively on this, then I think that we need to consult some of the experts or something like that. But with COVID-19, I would never have said, because you are skeptical of the vaccine, but you don't have a medical degree, you shouldn't comment, right? So I think that's maybe an analogy that we can draw.
Yeah, and I mean, like my dad likes to say, has he phrased this? If you know what you're talking about, I don't care what degree you have. If you don't know what you're talking about, I also don't care what degree you have. It's just like, let's see your arguments. That's all I care about.
As any good epistemologist would say.
Yep.
Yeah. Logan, I think you had a class with Bethel's dad at least once, right? Didn't you?
Yeah.
Oh, really? Which class?
It was with Dr. Guyvit, but we had him as like a visiting lecturer a couple of times. And so...
Sweet. I did not know that.
Oh, I forgot the name
awesome.
of it. I bought it right when we recommended. It was like a story of like a pastor. I guess he's a pastor, but he's dying, and he's trying to figure out, what do I leave behind for my son? And so it was a really heartwarming, like a very good book, but he was like in tears when he's explaining, like, you need to read this. So I went and bought it. It was an excellent book.
Oh, Gilead. Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, he loves Gilead. We love that book.
It was a very
book. The author's Marilyn Robinson. I hate her theology, but she's a great novelist. Everyone go read Gilead.
Yeah, I've heard of that book. It's always in like the top 100 like works of literature that you have to read or something before you die.
Like Obama loves it, but I'm sorry to say it really is good. So ignore the fact that Obama loves it and just read it.
Well, look, and with regards to like whether or not, I mean, everybody's got to start their project somewhere, and you're never going to start off as an expert. I mean, there are ways to be intellectually humble. The philosophical phrase, it seems to me, is always very useful, or just using probabilistic terms. It might be, it could be the case, it's likely that, I mean, there's always a way to just rhetorically to make sure we're qualifying certain claims, right? Which may take, again, some practice. But okay, that aside though, we wanted to maybe turn the lens back on the apologetics community a little bit and ask the question, not whether apologists are lying. I mean, which I think we could probably prima facie dismiss that as just a rhetorical device. Making that claim that they're lying is a rhetorical device. But whether or not like we're putting our best foot forward, and maybe there's some legitimate critiques that are being made against the apologetics community, whereby we might say we're not doing a great job of policing up our own, sort of say. And I think, Bethel, I think you wanted to weigh in on that a little bit.
Yeah, I have thoughts. I've
one or two.
So, I don't, in fact, think that we're sending our best. And I do think we have a mix of some outright just bad actors, I'm going to come out and say, who actually are lying, although not necessarily in ways that skeptics would necessarily care about. Because, I mean, to skeptics, we're all just a bunch of lying apologists, and I don't think they're necessarily going to be interested in some of the more subtle kind of in-house criticisms I want to bring forward. And so, in a sense, this isn't really a conversation for them unless they actually care about the truth, which I'm not convinced they do. But if you actually do care about the truth, then we need to be truthful in our research and our work. And I think that certain apologists have not always been. And I think that if there is an insecurity, there's an insecurity among, I would say, certain evangelical apologists who have a deep-seated fear of scholars thinking they're fundamentalists, right? So there's the fundamentalist evangelical split, I think, kind of festers for a lot of people. So, I'll go ahead and just say I think Mike Licona is a really unfortunate example of this. I think that Mike cares way too much what the guild thinks of him. But, he still wants to keep a foot in the world of evangelicalism. And so a lot of his research is just frankly not good substantively. The arguments are poor, and I think that's been effectively demonstrated in various in work my mom has done. But also, he doesn't take kindly to being criticized. He doesn't want to actually have the debate, admit where he might have gone wrong, represent his opponent's views fairly. He doesn't want to do any of those, kind of basic scholarly academic things because he feels like he has a sort of a privileged position in the apologetics world, and he cares more about maintaining that image than having a fair scholarly discourse. And so I think there's lots of issues with personality politics, lots of issues with cheap endorsements. That's something when you kind of peek behind the curtain of apologetics publishing and you sort of learn how the sausage is made, of how those blurbs show up on the back of your favorite apologetics books. People don't necessarily actually read the books. They just see, oh, my friend wrote a book. Here's a blurb, And just for the record, my mom, in getting endorsements for her work, she made sure that her publisher told people, please do not endorse this book unless you have actually read it or read a substantial amount of it and you really feel it's worth endorsing. I do not want your cheap blurb. And so that's an issue, I think. And then I think there's an issue with just general sloppiness. Even people who aren't being outright deceptive, like I would say Licona is outright deceptive, but I would say somebody like Gary Habermas, I don't think Habermas is lying in his research. I just think that it's not well put together. It's not well done. And I think it's unfortunate that, at this point, Habermas's reputation is so cemented. Everyone just assumes, here's Gary Habermas, world's foremost expert on the resurrection. The people aren't even taking the time to sort of stop and pause and say, wait, but are his arguments actually good? Is he actually presenting the literature well? Is he, can we rely on his research? And they're not really checking his work. They just kind of automatically give it a pass. And if you actually check his work, it's not good work. And so unfortunately, we don't really have a great system of checks and balances in that sense. And somebody like my mom and dad are trying to provide that, but they've kind of been shut out. And unfortunately, that says nothing good about the state of the apologetics industrial complex, let's say.
All right, I'm gonna step back here. I'm gonna step back because the can of worms, the proverbial can of worms, has been
they're all over
opened.
the place. I'm sorry.
I will just say, to safeguard my own self, I've never read anything by Licona or Habermas. I just never have. And on the flip side, I've only read one book by Ehrman. I will say that as I read through my commentaries, New Testament commentaries, I've never seen them referenced, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But okay, so I'm not aware of any of their actual written works, although I have seen interviews, podcasts, the occasional debate of theirs online. And I certainly saw Gary Habermas at least once or twice at a conference or something where he did his 40-minute sort of presentation of the early testimonies regarding the resurrection. So that's all my knowledge of them really is. I don't know anything about their writing. So, but I'll open it up now for Logan and Lenny then to comment here.
Here you go. Here, stick your head out there. See if the sniper's still pointing his gun. No. So a couple of prefaces. First of all, I know both men well. I've been friends with Gary and Mike for quite a while now, and I've read The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, which was their popular level book. I haven't gotten Gary's magnum opus yet because it's huge. And I just right now don't have the time to go through it. I don't. I do have the new historiography, the Lacona book that he put out as well. I think Lacona has actually probably even modified his views since he first published that book, since that book first came out. I do know also that Mike tends to be overly doubtful, critically doubtful when I don't think it's warranted. I remember JP and I talked about it a little bit, and he said, I like Mike a lot, but I think Lydia's right. And that was JP Moreland's kind of approach. And I kind of go with that same way as well. When I look at the data, whenever I look in the past at when people have kind of tried to analyze or scrutinize New Testament things, and they say, well, this can't be true because of X, Y, and Z. Usually you wait a little while and we find out something that shows that, no, it's actually true. We just didn't understand it that way. So, but for that, I would say with Gary, I think maybe some people misunderstand what he's trying to do. And what he was, in my understanding, trying to do was simply to say, look, if consensus is the baseline, it kind of goes back to our previous point. If we're going to assume consensus, then here are at least 3 points that consensus has overwhelmingly agreed upon. And now, if I'm taking the position of the atheist, how in the world do you respond to that? Because you're the one that's assuming this consensus. Now, what do? I don't know that he's saying the minimal facts approach is the best way for all Christian apologists to argue the resurrection. So I'm not certain on that.
Yeah. So, okay, a couple things there. So I guess I'll take Lacona first. So to expand on the issue with Lacona, it's not just that I don't think his work is good. It's that he has, I think it's clear now, he's been willfully giving a false impression of what his views actually are. And he'll kind of morph and shift depending on what his audience is. And he will also persist in straw manning the opposition. I mean, like he was on a podcast where someone said, could you just like steel man your criticisms so people know, what the objections are? And he immediately proceeded to do a straw man instead of a steel man. And he just will not listen to criticism, doesn't care, has tried over and over to smear my mom as some kind of a fringe weirdo who shouldn't be taken seriously and whose work isn't worth looking into. And I'm sorry to say that William Lane Craig has played, I would say, an enabling role in this kind of stuff. Mike put out a series of videos where there's a lot of fanfare, like, I am answering Lydia McGrew. Here's my answers. And they were not actually answering her arguments. They were just bad. But William Lane Craig just was like, oh, okay, good. He's answering Lydia, and sort of gave an endorsement without really pausing to take the time to understand what was at stake. So I kind of blame Craig for that, for kind of using his position as the grand old man and being less careful than he should be. Much love and respect to Craig. Obviously, he's done good work. I don't want to denigrate the good things he's done, but I think he needs to pay more attention to some of the problems in the House. The other thing I would say to Habermas, and this is going to get into a little more, actual substance about the quality of the arguments. Habermas, and it took a while for my folks to kind of dig in and realize this as well. So he himself can be a little confusing in how he presents this, but what he will assert over and over again is, well, number one, if Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is true, which already I don't concede that. But also, number two, I can argue, I can make the case with one hand tied behind my back. And I think it's very clear, various YouTube interviews and things he's done, he would say, this is the way that you should argue if you're in any kind of a skeptical setting or a hostile setting, and you want to be taken seriously by people who might be suspicious of Christian apologists. Use the skeptical scholars' words against them, and it's like a kind of a judo move in that sense. So I think he definitely was, and this is certainly how many people since Gary have read it and used it, and even Catholics as well. I saw Trent Horn saying this just the other day in response to the Jubilee video with Alex. It's like they should have used minimal fats. That's the better way to go here. So I think that's just established. And then I would say the problem is that what's twofold. First of all, if you dig in and look at the quotes that Gary brings out from scholars, again and again, they're not actually saying what he thinks they're saying. So that's a big problem. And number two, once you actually look at what they do grant, what they do concede, it's pretty minimal. I mean, like, it's too minimal, right? It's so minimal, it's not enough to actually get you over the finish line, so that the resurrection really is the best explanation. If you restrict yourself, deliberately limit yourself to those kinds of things. And so if you look at what Wesley did on Joe Rogan's show, when the resurrection came up, Wesley was emphasizing, he didn't just say the disciples claimed that they had had appearances, that they'd had experiences of the risen Jesus. They claimed to have eaten with him, to have talked with him, had long conversations. They claimed to have touched him, right? And he emphasized those details. And I think you actually need to do that in order to really get the argument off the ground. I don't think it's enough to just say they had experiences. But once you do emphasize those details, then thank you, Alex. You are going to be in the minority in terms of where the scholarship is. And I think that's fine. Then at that point, let's just have the argument. But we need to stop worrying so much. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so, and I agree. I don't think one is mutually exclusive of the other. I think the question is what kind of experiences should be the natural follow-up, and then you need to say those specific examples because that will come into, the rebutting of the mass hallucination or the, hopeful fable or all of these other kind of secondary rejections that you start to show up in that case. So again, I've never seen Gary in a debate. And I don't have his scholastic work yet to which I can refer to it, but I can see it as being a blunt arrow to initiate the conversation. One of the pieces in our quiver that we can use in at least some aspect when we're talking with other people.
Well, maybe the minimal facts, and this is you probably should have your mom on, Bethel, to discuss cool. the minimal versus the maximal. What does she call it? The maximal data?
Maximal data, yeah.
Yeah, the minimal of X versus maximal. Because I think it is an interesting methodological question. And could be that the minimal facts approach is a little time-bound at this point and tread-worn in that, well, people don't seem as skeptical so much. I mean, the culture's shifting. At least that's going to be part of the thesis in my
Well, and if you look at it, right. Well, if you read a guy like Dale Allison, okay, Dale is, I think he's like Alex O'Connor's favorite skeptical writer at this point. He's just like quoting the glorious Dale Allison. It's like gosh. Anyway, Allison is fascinated with paranormal stuff.
Yeah, he's into all kinds of things.
Exactly, like all kinds of. He's willing to say, "Oh, sure, of course, I acknowledge the world is really weird. Weird stuff happens all the time."
Mystical.
So he's just exactly. And so he's just going to chuck the resurrection in, along with all the other weird stuff that might have happened. But he's going to do it in a very watered down, heretical way. That does
it's a syncretistic kind of, instead of like a strict, it's more of a syncretistic religious pluralism kind of view of strange things happen around the world over time, in India, in Africa, in various places, and people have all kinds of experiences of the dead or it's sort of like a history of religions kind of view, right?
Right. And unfortunately, and again, I'm sorry to not William Lane Craig, but I mean, I think like he and I definitely Lacona, I think maybe Habermas as well, will refer to Dale Allison as a Christian. And he's just not. I'm sorry. He's an elder of the PCUSA. That doesn't count.
Yeah, no, I understand. Like he'll self-identify as a Christian, but you're talking about
people will get offended if you say he's not, but oh well.
Whether or not he would meet the criteria of a historic and orthodox Christian or not. And I think that needs to be distinguished. Yeah. That needs to be distinguished. You can say I'm a Christian. I mean, I just wrote an article on Marianne Booty, and I'm like, look, why would we take an Episcopalian priestess as a serious Christian who doesn't even, I mean, okay, that's another thing, but But yeah, I mean, all kinds of people call themselves Christian. I mean, Billy Carson maybe called himself a Christian. I
Right,
don't know.
right, exactly. And I think this is an issue I see with
Yeah.
Christian apologists. There can be an over haste and an over almost a kind of neediness, I guess. It's like, somebody at the cool kids table is saying some vaguely positive stuff. Quickly,
Yes.
let's have him on our podcast. Like this happened with Philip Goff. Philip Goff announces his conversion to something or other. But like, it's super exciting. And like, it's not that exciting. I'm sorry.
Deism is basically Orthodox Christianity at this point, or something like. Yeah, no, we'd have to be careful on that. I think there is that. I don't know. John West just wrote a book. I haven't looked at it yet, so I don't know. But called like Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. But that's this idea that we've been beaten up. Feel like we've been beaten up so much over the last 30 or 40 years. I think the Brits are especially in this milieu. They work in this like where if anybody even references, just says something I mean, this came out when Thomas Nagel wrote his book Mind and Cosmos. Was it Mind and Cosmos?
Mind and Cosmos.
I think so.
Thomas Nagel is basically a Christian, and you're like, well, not really. He said some nice things about.
I mean, Nagel is the guy who said, "I don't believe in a God. I don't want the world to be like that."
Yeah.
Like, he was super honest about that. I'm like, no.
I mean, he called into question, Darwinian evolution and a materialistic view of that, but it's not like.
I think this is really a problem of the church writ large. I mean, they were trumpeting Kanye, for example.
I know. I might have fallen into
Rice.
that briefly.
And the problem is when we take these celebrities and we throw them. Yeah. We take the celebrities, we put them in the spotlight immediately. Even the Apostle Paul had to spend 3 years in the desert being discipled before he got his face shown again. If it was today, they would have put him on every talk show a week later. So
I mean, I'm very concerned about this Russell Brand guy who I never heard of until he became a Christian.
And now he's trying to hop on the Wesley Huff train, which that's a weird crossover. When I saw that pop, I'm like, really? Okay, but I don't. I'm just
because I don't know. Like, I'll speak personally here. After my conversion, which was a religious experience in a Protestant church during the sermon, where I had a visible experience of Jesus and an audible experience of Jesus. I mean, like the next several years, as enthusiastic as I was for many years, as many new converts are, like there was still like there was like I have a past, and like I'm not really proud of it, and everything, there because anyways, but look, you don't know. I'm not saying that Russell Brand or others are not, but there is a sense of like, why would we, because they're celebrities. I'll make 2 points real quick, and then we'll probably have to draw this to a close. One is there is a sense like, okay, they're a celebrity, so we want to use them as leverage for the worldview, right? But then, you're treating guys who are babes in the faith, right? You're giving them a sort of authority that maybe someday they might have, but they really don't have, right? And even there with like Jordan Peterson, who's a smart guy, right? But it's like 90% of the things that Jordan Peterson says have been rejected, by the church. These Jungian archetype hermeneutics and everything. So they sound interesting, and maybe thank him for getting theology popular again. But it's like, we shouldn't be treating him just de facto as like an Orthodox Christian or even an authority on Christianity. And then the flip side of that is, there is a sense of where when somebody, Augustine makes this point in one of his letters where he talks about Victorinus. You can look it up. There is a sense of where when somebody who's very famous becomes a Christian, think of like somebody who we know had a legitimate conversion and ended well, like a Chuck Colson, right? Who was very well known, infamously known, right? And my oldest son is named after him. But, there is a sense of where they're thrown into a situation. Now they are famous in some regard. And that does kind of reverberate through the culture if they're well known and they become a Christian. So we do have to sort of like handle that at least in some way, because when a celebrity or somebody who's very popular in the culture converts, people are going to take notice of that, and there's no way to really not take notice of it.
Yeah, and just to kind of trying to kind of loop back to where this all started, because I brought up Dale Allison and talking about how Christians are sometimes too eager if it feels like somebody cool is noticing them. I think the version of this that I wanted to highlight at the academic level is we shouldn't settle for arguments that will get you to the level of someone like Dale Allison. That's not good enough. It's not just good enough to make the case for something weird happening, as opposed to an actually solid case that's going to stand up under hard knocks that Jesus was who he said he was, and physically, bodily, rose from the dead. We need to reclaim the forward position, I think, as apologists, and just be willing to stake that out. And by the way, this is something I know that Wesley agrees with. We have mutual friends, and he agrees that the maximal approach is the future. I think the future of apologetics is maximalist.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, we didn't talk to him about that, but I've talked to Wes in the past about things, and I think that's right. Putting our being a little more assertive and with better arguments, and not being so much, like I said, like, oh, we've been beaten up over the last several decades, mainly on account of logical positivism and its errors, but okay. I mean, we don't need to do that, right? Logan?
Well, and I don't know if this is a feature of how we've set up our academic disciplines, or maybe a feature of at least an implicit. I know it was explicit when I was studying philosophy. It was, well, you have those who deal with people outside the church, and you have those who deal with people inside the church. And I think what you end up getting is these sort of fragmentary minimalist arguments that, oh, if we can just meet the lowest possible bar, then maybe we'll be kind of cool. And then this is where you start trafficking all these people who just meet the absolute minimum threshold. In contrast, I think if we do the maximum arguments, which I think we should be doing, there's going to be, I think, just a natural blending of addressing the outside world and addressing inside the church that I think, or at least it seems in my experience with different people I studied philosophy with, those sorts of things, they don't want to have that debate with the church on these issues, because now it's going to be theologically rich, not minimalistically sort of like veneer.
All right. Well, let me add to that, because I think there's something analogous here. So primarily when we're talking like about the Apologetics project over the last several years, it's been with regards to, the truth questions. Are these claims true? Right. We've noticed a shift in the culture of not like, even if the biblical claims, the systematic theological claims are true, are they good? Right. So I wrote an article last year for Touchstone talking about, the challenge of the natural sciences, when the natural sciences had sort of epistemic hegemony in the culture, right? It was the physicists and the chemists and the biologists who were going to tell us what was true. And then the church sort of had to, answer that challenge, and you get Swinburne and Planning and so on and so forth. But, when the social sciences sort of emerged now more recently, in the therapeutic sciences, if there are such thing, psychology, then the question shifts to whether or not Christian doctrines are sort of good for people or not, and you get that type of thing. So the analog here, I think there is, we also have to be a little bit more forceful in our presentation of the goodness of Christianity, not just the truthfulness, that our social doctrines are the right ones, right? That Christian morality is the right morality. It is what is best. The Christian ethic is what is best for the human person. And not be so on the defensive there as well.
Yeah, we've talked to
Right.
a lot of Christian scholars who are hesitant to talk about the
Yeah.
goodness of the
Yeah. I
Christian.
mean, there's a very defensive posture with regards to, oh, how good really, the Christian ethic is, you know. So, okay, Bethel, this has been good. So we touched on a lot of things. I want to wrap up. Let's just maybe go around the horn. Any final thoughts? But we talked about the atheist YouTubers, the claim, some of these accusations, but then also this need to be careful in policing up our own articulation, presentation, argumentation for the Christian revelation claims. So I don't know, Bethel, let's give you the last word here.
Yeah. So I think we should be serious and rigorous in our work. There's such a thing as being objectively rigorous, producing objectively good scholarship. And I think the apologetics community has some work to do and some ways to go in holding itself to that standard. At the same time, we should just be prepared for the fact that objectively good scholarship doesn't necessarily align with what atheist counter-apologists think objectively good scholarship looks like. So we shouldn't do our work and hold ourselves to those standards under any illusions that our work is suddenly magically going to win over a whole bunch of Alex O'Connors. That's not how this sort of stuff works. That's not how any of this works, as the meme goes.
Yeah.
The process of converting or winning people over, or the drive to try and sort of package Christianity or distill our arguments down into something we can just hand people and get them in the door. I mean, in a lot of ways, that's how we got to where we are now. That's how some of our problems got started, is that kind of always be closing attitude. So I think abandon the always be closing attitude. Just do good stuff and allow the chips to fall where they may.
I think it's a good word and a nice Glenn Ross
Yes.
reference there to end on. So Bethel, it's always good to have you on. I know we didn't get to see you today because of technical difficulties.
Sorry.
But I'm glad we got it done. And this has been the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Leave a comment below if you enjoyed this podcast, or even if you didn't. And we hope to see you next time. God bless everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.